So, Bella, how are you today?
I'm well, thanks. How are you doing, John?
Yes, pretty good. I'm excited about this. We've got a lot to get through. We just had a brief conversation didn't we, before we started here to say that it's going to be an ambitious project to get through everything here in 45 minutes, but we'll give it our best shots. This is the second EDT, Evolve Development Tracker webinar. The first one was at the end of term one, where we looked at the data for the autumn term. And now you've had some time looking at our T2 data, which was for the spring term up until Easter. So that's the purpose of today. We're going to get right into it. So I guess the summary from my side, you have to correct me if I'm wrong here, Bella, as you're very good at doing in a polite and very nice, kind way. The summary from T1, I think I was right in saying that we were selecting the right schools to work with and the right mentees in line with that social purpose. And that was looking at the demographics of those students that we were working with. And we also had some positive news about improvements that were being made in the first term. Normally we don't see that. It's term two when we start seeing the improvements in their well-being and other school performance indicators. And we left the webinar to say it'd be interesting to look at the differences between primary and secondary. So is there anything else just to tee things up here, just to remind people about from T1's data?
I think that was a really good summary, actually, John.
I'm not very good at keeping things short and concise, but I did listen to the webinar again a couple of days back just to refresh my memory in terms of where we are, because it's important to pick up the thread from there, because we're not going to go back on that first term. It's this second term's data that we're really interested in now. How's it been? What does the data look like?
Well, we have continued good news. So, yes, continued good news, and you can see that really clearly visually on this chart. We see that the wellbeing gap is narrowing, it continues to narrow. So, from baseline to term two, so that's September, the start of the academic year, we see the greatest wellbeing compass improvement in the mentees, and the shadows have decreased each term. The non-mentees have increased, but to a lesser extent than the mentees. The overall academic year, the picture is really positive. And then just focusing in on term two, so building on the previous report, we've seen the same rate of change in all three groups, which is really interesting. So in the mentees and the others, we've seen an increase of 0.75%. And then the shadows, we've seen a decrease of 0.75%. And I think the fact that the mentees and the others are increasing at the same rate is really reflecting the beneficial effects of the health mentors. We have to remember that the shadows are almost acting like a matched control. They're giving a good indication of how the mentees would be doing without that health mentor intervention. So the fact that the mentees are not only doing a lot better than the shadows, but they're actually increasing at the same rate as everyone else in the classroom is really, really a positive picture. So this is just our domain by domain view. And thinking about the year-to-date view, we see the mentees increasing across all domains. That is just the one exception here. But actually, when we look at that in the context of how the shadows are doing and how the others are doing, our mentees are doing really well. Our shadows have decreased by more than 5% since baseline, whereas for the others and the mentees, it's just under, it's not even 1% decrease. So I think with that context, that's a success. And we know that diet is a really tricky one to modify. And then in terms of the areas with the biggest increases, we have sleep, physical activity, and self-efficacy. And you may recall from term one that sleep and physical activity are the areas with the lowest baselines for all groups. So these are probably areas that all young people could benefit from intervention. So again, really positive to see continued impact for the mentees in these areas. And then thinking again just about term two, so building on the previous reporting, we've seen an increase in all domains. Just emotional wellbeing is the only one that mentees have not increased in this term. It's important to say that they have increased in emotional wellbeing from the start of the academic year, and I think that's kind of the key thing that we're looking at. But that just might be an area of focus for the final term, so we can really end on a high with increases across all domains.
Now, Bella, I'm going to have to pause you there because I did have some questions on some of the data here, but just listening to you, and I've heard for those who are listening that Bella kindly joins our management meetings and provides regular updates on some of these data insights. And I've had this presentation and looked at some of the data myself, but I've also just come up with some extra questions here. So just before we get onto the differences between primary and secondary, just to clarify that first insight you shared there. So what we're saying is we've got three groups when we're tracking the data here from the schools that we're working with. We have all pupils in the school. We have the mentees that we work with, typically 10% of the school population, up to a cohort of 30 if the mentor is in school for 5 days a week. And then we've identified you mentioned them as a matched control, and we call them shadow mentees. They're mentees who we would be working with if we had a second mentor in the school or if we could increase our caseload. And they're called our shadow mentees. So similarly, they've got a low level of well-being. So there are three groups. And just to clarify, because I think this is an important point, the shadow mentees aren't getting our intervention. And across most of the domains, their well-being is decreasing, whereas our mentees and the other pupils in the school are increasing. Is that correct?
That's correct. And I think it's also on that point, it's worth saying that the shadows are the group, as you said, who would next benefit from intervention, but they're not the group in the classroom who most need the intervention. That's the mentees. So actually, the shadows give us a good indicator of how the mentees would be performing, but actually, likely the scores would be even slightly lower than we're seeing on the shadows. So it really is a big success to see these patterns.
Just to drill down a little deeper on that one. Our data, at least, is suggesting that the well-being of children and young people, so that's across the 6 domains that you've highlighted, so emotional well-being, physical activity, sleep, diet, personal development, self-efficacy, those domains there, they're increasing for the majority of pupils in schools, even those with low starting points, if we're working with them. But if they have low starting points and there's no additional intervention, their well-being is deteriorating through the school year. Is that correct?
That seems to be the case.
Well, that's interesting. It's worth highlighting, I feel. And when you got into the specific domains, you did mention diet,
Yes.
and we've had some feedback from health mentors, especially our newer health mentors, who say it's very difficult to impact on that one. I think I remember talking about this in our T1, our Term 1 webinar, where it said even though it is difficult to impact on diet and sleep to a similar extent, because it's under parental influence. Parents are the ones who are encouraging children to go to bed at a certain time and what goes in the lunchbox or if they have a school meal. But ultimately, children do have some say in all of this because they may be sent to bed at a certain time. But if they get their phone out and start looking at Instagram or playing computer games, that's on them. And similarly, they do have some influence over what they're eating. So I agree that those well-being domains are probably harder to shift, but you've identified that diet is one that's not necessarily moving as quickly as the others. Is that right?
Yes, and as I say, when we do compare to the shadows, the mentees are doing significantly better. The mentees are only slightly under the others. I think others are 0.5% decrease and mentees are 0.78% decrease. So, these are still, I think, all positive changes. But in terms of moving, into the green, perhaps there's more focus, more we can do there. But as you say, they have some choice, but it is difficult. And there may be economic factors, especially with diet, that are affecting our ability to modify those scores.
And it does move into another point that I was thinking about, because we collect the wellbeing compass data at 4 time points during the year. So the start of the year in September, and that's something I'll probably come back on and talk about a bit more when it relates to shadow selection. So we have a time point in September, and then at the end of each term, so December, April, and then end of June, early July, just before the summer break. Now, for us as an organisation, we like the interim, the formative assessment points, so T1 and T2, because we can adapt and amend our mentoring programs based on the results that we're getting. From a school's point of view, ultimately they want to see improvements from T0 at the start of the academic year to T3. And that's why it's really important that we get as much data as you can at the T3 interval. But T1 and T2 are really interesting because when we send our progress report into schools, we share this formative data with them. And if we've got a domain like diet here, which isn't progressing at the same rate, it's something that our mentors pay particular attention to. So it's interesting that diet is still something that we're struggling to shift at the same level. So as an organisation, that's something I might take back to our management team and say, what are we doing at the moment in this area? What's working? Which schools or which mentees is it working best for? And we can try and share some of that best practice. So there's a really interesting point here to say, yes, we are making progress in all of these areas, but there's definitely something more we can do, I think, when it comes to that diet domain.
I'm glad that the data is useful in that way. And I think it's as you say, it's really important for understanding what we can do, if we can do anything. It's a real strength of Evolve that they are monitoring term by term as we go, not just at baseline and end of the year. And obviously that's hugely important data, but in order to think about practice as the year goes on, it's really beneficial to have all these time points.
Bella, yeah, I know we've got a lot of data to get through here, and you're probably getting frustrated at the questions that I'm asking here because I'm going off topic slightly. But the system that we've got and this evolved development tracker, it was initially developed to assess our summative impact. So at the end of a year, school has invested in our work. What's the difference? And it does a really good job at doing that. But we thought, let's do more with this. And one of the things it's doing is helping us adjust and refine our individual programs. So every child has a bespoke program. What we're doing with them and the active ingredients, as they call it, they're tailored to each individual young person that we work with. There are general themes that emerge school by school level, but the area that we want to move into more with the EDT is how we identify the shadows and the selection of mentees to work with at the start of the year. And this is a point I did flag up earlier, and I said I'd return to it because I'm looking at a lot of these charts and I'm seeing that the shadow mentees are generally in a better place at the start of the year than our mentees are. And I'm just wondering how accurate they are as a matched control, as we referred to them earlier, because I have a feeling that we can do better here. How do you regard these shadows, and are they a suitable control for our mentees that we're working with?
I think that's a really interesting question and something that we can dig into the data a little bit more to understand whether there's maybe a few anomalies that are kind of driving that those numbers, or whether we're not quite selecting the right shadows. But I think, as you say, you can see it really clearly on the overall chart that our shadows are starting at baseline higher than our others, and that may just mean that we're not getting to see kind of the full effect of intervention because we're comparing to this group who we haven't quite selected precisely enough. So that's definitely an area that we can dig into and try to refine for the next academic year.
Yeah, and this is something that I think will be really relevant to our school partners who we're working with, because there are children who generally need additional support and they're known to the school at the start of the year. So when we sit down and set up the program, they'll say, well, here's our caseload that we'd like you to work with. And then we do our baseline data collection at T-Naught in September. And I think it might be worth spending a little bit more time at the start of the year on our mentee selection and caseloads, because there may be a cohort that the school have in mind. But I think we should then do the baseline survey across the whole year group or across the whole school, especially in primary, and then compare that data with what the school intelligence says and who the students are that they would like us to work with. Because I have a feeling there are some students who are potentially suffering in silence. They're not exhibiting any negative behaviours, so they're not known or not on the school's radar for additional interventions. And there may be some latent vulnerabilities in terms of their overall well-being and their engagement in school that aren't quite correlating. So I do think that our use of the Evolve Development Tracker, not just this Wellbeing Compass survey, but there's also the Classroom Climate Survey and the Pupil Performance Survey that teachers can complete to give a rounded view. And that will really do a better job informing not just selection of mentees to work with, but also to match each of those mentees with a shadow. I think at the moment we're doing a good job tracking mentees, but I think that the selection of shadows could be improved. And I think that that's something that I'll definitely take away and discuss with the management team, because we may not have a big enough sample of data to select from when it comes to the shadows. If we're only tracking mentees in a school and we don't have that comparison group, it does limit our analysis here. So I would love to see the blue dot at T-Naught and the green dot, which is in the middle here for shadows, almost being matched identically. And that would be a much richer comparison for future analysis. There is a question I'm leading to here, Bella, because it's got me thinking about something else. We seem to be only working with mentees who have got low wellbeing scores. Now, more often than not, schools haven't done any analysis like this themselves. It's just a reaction to their school performance, their engagement in school, and then we scratch under the surface and we see, oh, actually, look at their wellbeing. It's pretty poor. It's a low starting point. One thing we might want to look at, and this is probably something for our development plan in September, if there are any students that we're working with that have been referred to us by schools who have got really high levels of wellbeing at the start of the year, it's just something that's occurred to me. This isn't something that I was planning to ask, and I'm probably putting you on the spot a little bit with this question. It could be something we dig into the data this year and look for, but we generally get children referred to us who are exhibiting negative behaviours, not learning at the expected level of progress, and there may be issues that extend back to previous years. So they're the children that we generally work with. But I wonder how many of those, if any, are doing well with their overall perceived well-being. I have a hypothesis here that in almost every case, the children that we're working with who are struggling in school, they have very worrying well-being compass data. Is that something that we could look at this year, do you think, with the sample size that we have, or is it something that's worth looking at and setting up for in September?
I think it depends, I would say, how much of that data that we've got in terms of how the mentees are being selected versus kind of everyone else. So I guess what I'm saying is it depends how much holistic data we have around the EDT that would enable us to match up and look at this is the wellbeing score. We have attendance score, for example, as kind of a proxy for engagement. Maybe if we had some data on attainment or kind of behavioral issues, we would be able to start to link those things up and kind of get a bigger picture and start to answer some of those questions. But if not this year, then I think that's would definitely be an interesting project for next year. And we have discussed selection. That's something that we're interested in exploring. So I think there's a place for that there within that project.
We will get back on track very soon. I'm keen just to spend a little longer on this because I think some interesting developments might emerge. So we're assuming at the moment, and I think it's a fairly solid assumption, that we're working with children who are of a concern to a school. It may be the case that we've used the Wellbeing Compass survey and other EDT insights to help that selection, but we're not going to be using valuable school and educational resources to work with children who don't need that support. So I think that's a fairly safe assumption to make, that the children we're working with need some support. So if we look at the whole sample set here, we can see that their well-being is lower than the rest of the school population. So that correlation is there. Children who need support, according to our data, they have lower levels of well-being. I think what we should do as an action following this webinar here is just try and look for a few outliers. So mentees who have got high levels of self-reported well-being at T0, T1 and T2. And then we could probably do a spotlight on them because we, on top of this wellbeing data, we do have those other surveys that I referenced earlier, and we have had an increasing number of schools this year use the classroom climate survey and the pupil performance survey. I think that gives us a much better level of detail in terms of their needs. Yes, we've got the school attendance data and punctuality data. That's for all students in the system. But if we have some students who have got mentees that are working with us that are doing really, really well with their well-being, however, class teacher or form teacher, if it's a secondary school, are saying that they're still disengaged, they're not making that expected level of progress, they're not focusing in the classroom, then there's something I think we can dig into there with those students to try and understand why. Because our whole theory of change and our hypothesis here is that well-being is an overlooked childhood development factor in schools. Most of the focus is on pedagogy and making sure that children are making the expected level of learning progress, but not expected level of well-being progress. So maybe just as a small exercise within our analysis for the T3 webinar, it might be worth just highlighting any students who are bucking the trend. Now, that might be something that you have to push back on because we've got a lot of other things to look at, but I'd certainly be interested in maybe from the numbers that we've got, the number of mentees that we're working with, as a percentage, how many of those pupils are causing problems in school or not making the expected level of progress, and yet well-being isn't a factor. I'm sure you can summarise that a bit more concisely, but I think that would be really interesting to look at.
I've made a note of that, John, and I will do my best.
I think we should get back on track. So,
Okay.
what's the difference between primary and secondary school? And this is something that we were very interested in following the T1 analysis. And historically, we've only worked in primary schools. More recently, certainly happening before COVID, children weren't arriving into year 7 secondary ready. We had a very successful transition program where we started doing that transitional journey with mentees. So our mentor worked in primaries with them in year 6 and then went into the secondary school with them for the autumn term in year 7. but now we're working with far more secondary schools than we've ever done before. So our data set is possibly shifting as a result. So tell us more. Differences between primary and secondary mentees.
Yeah, so I'm excited to share this because I think it's quite a kind of an interesting story to the data, which is probably really nerdy of me, but we'll see if our listeners agree. So overall, you can see the pink line is reflecting primary and the red line is reflecting secondary. And our primary schools actually seem to start lower overall on wellbeing compass outcomes at the baseline, but then they increase pretty well term on term, and overall from September, that's an increase of 6%. Now in secondary, there is an initial decrease between September and the end of term 1. And then there's a slight increase that we've seen in the last term that's just elapsed. So between our baseline and end of term 2, that is a slight increase overall of 0.5%. And then we can look at the domain by domain view. And again, this is just, sorry, I should have said for the previous slide, but we're just looking at the mentees for now. So at a glance, you can kind of see that there seems to be a bit more change and improvement in primary, and we'd kind of expect that from the chart that we've just seen. The overall cumulative change is 6%, so we would expect that to be seen reflected in the domains as well. And there's a bit more stagnation in secondary schools, it would appear. So particular domains to highlight in primary, actually all of them. Our mentees are improving across all domains, but most notably sleep, and that's 14.48% improvement, in diet, 7.71%. So really big numbers there and really pleasing to see. And then in secondary, we have physical activity is the area with the most improvement, and that's 4.58%, and self-efficacy, 2.54% improvement. And we do also see an improvement in emotional well-being, but actually in all other domains, there is a decrease. And sleep and diet are the two that take the largest hit. We've spoken about those, so quite interesting that they come up here. Although with both of those, it's worth saying that it's less than a 2% decrease. So it's not a huge decrease. And I think in a kind of adolescent sample, we might expect to see some challenges in these areas. So that probably doesn't come as a huge surprise. But then if we could move on, I think this is really interesting and really drives home for me the importance of having the different groups as a point of comparison. Because in the previous graph, we saw that it looked as though primary are doing pretty well and secondary are doing well, but they're struggling a bit more. Actually, if we compare our mentees to our shadows and everyone else in the classroom, in secondary schools, the mentees are doing 20 times better than shadows. So that's, a huge difference. And they're even doing better than everyone else. They're doing 5 times better than our other group. And in primary, we see a 6% improvement, as I've said, in mentees. That's about 4 times better than shadows, and it is better than everyone else as well. So you can see that the story is not always quite as it seems, and that our comparison groups are very, very important for providing that context. And then just to take it one step further, we've had a look by year group. And so starting in primary, you can see that there's kind of a general improvement across primary school. There's a little bit of a dip in year 4, but we're still very much in the green. And then from year 6 to year 9, we see a little bit more of a decrease. Some lower wellbeing compass scores overall. And that is probably a reflection of transition, which we know is a really difficult period for our young people and adolescents, of course, coinciding with that. And we are talking about doing some research regarding Accelerate, Evolve's transition program, which will be running over the summer. So we're really excited to look into that in more detail, because that potentially is something that really can have some impact on those scores in the earlier secondary year. Worth saying as well, I think, just a last point, and then I promise I will stop and John can ask me some questions if he has any. But the mentees are outperforming shadows and others in years 3, 4, and 5. And then the data becomes a little bit more scarce for our non-mentee group. So it is difficult to kind of contextualize in those year groups where we see that our mentees are in the red, how they're doing compared to everyone else. We know overall in secondary they're doing a lot better than everyone else, but we don't necessarily have that level of detail at that granular year group by year group level. But we do know overall in secondary, our mentees are doing 20 times better than our shadows.
Fascinating. So this is something that we've not had before, partly because we've not worked with as many secondary schools and the numbers weren't as didn't have the statistical significance that we were looking for. As you can probably imagine, I've got quite a few questions here. So I guess to start things off, one of the concerns I had when I looked at data in T1 was the fact that the level of improvement didn't match previous research that we've done, and not just one-off research, but we had, initially it was Leeds Beckett University, then we had Centre for Education and Youth look at this, and Health Foundation also had a go, and they're all saying the same thing about our intervention, and that was in the first term from T0 up to T1, not much in the way of improvements as a combined wellbeing score, but then by the end of T1, the difference was about 5% of an improvement. And then it was in the final term of the year, T3, when we saw an extra 10%. So it was 15% aggregated throughout the year. Now, we weren't seeing that in the T1 data before. And I was a little bit concerned about it. But I was really encouraged there when you said that looking at the primary school data on its own, we are seeing a 6% improvement from T0 to T2, which matches previous research. It's 1% higher than previous research. But then in secondary schools, we're not seeing that same level of improvement. And I think that the chart that's on the screen here, which is the breakdown by year group, that probably explains why that 6% improvement in primary is suppressed. So have I read the data correctly there, Bella? Is that good as an accurate interpretation?
Yeah, I think so, if I'm understanding you correctly. But I think that the summary really is very much that we would expect to see different patterns in different age groups. And with the comparative groups, we can really see that. But without the comparative groups, it's very difficult to say whether our mentees are underperforming, overperforming, how they're doing compared to their peers. So for me, definitely it drives home the importance of having that context and having those kind of control groups. And I think also what's interesting here is that a lot of interventions, at least from my reading of the scientific literature, a lot of interventions are universal, meaning everyone in the classroom has them. And when you're providing universal interventions, there aren't always control groups. Schools are often kind of hesitant to have control groups because they say, well, if it works, shouldn't we be giving it to everyone? So a lot of that research, you may not have that kind of comparative group, but obviously what Evolve are doing is a different model. It's a targeted intervention. They're working with the pupils that need the most. And it does afford us this opportunity of having controls. So it's really beneficial in terms of the data and to see that our health mentors are performing extremely well and we're seeing positive change in our young people.
Well, yeah, this is interesting because I think the reason why we're struggling with those context of secondary and having all pupils and shadow mentees complete the surveys is just because of how secondary schools are structured and what their curriculum looks like. It's much easier to implement the EDT at primary because the classes with the same teacher all day long, all week, and they can easily just complete this in a registration period. The wellbeing compass survey is 15 minutes. The classroom climate, the teacher can do it at the same time. It's 5 minutes. They can do the pupil performance one, takes a little bit longer as well, but that's 15, 20 minutes. And they have a good insight into all of their pupils. Where we tried to replicate that in secondary school, it's not been as easy because the students don't have a set teacher to work with all years. Where it has been implemented well, it's because it's the form tutors that do this, and they do get a good insight from other class teachers about how they're performing in English, maths, and subject areas. And that's a good time to do it, but it does draw into question another point that I wanted to raise about the honesty of responses. And there'll be some differences here between primary and secondary. And it's much easier for us when we're in a primary school setting because the teachers aren't rushing to get this done. They can build a lesson around it. But when we're asking secondary school teachers to do this, if you wanted it across the whole year group, we'd either have to work with form tutors or pick a subject area. So, for example, during an English lesson, a maths lesson, but where I think it fits best is when it's part of a PSHE program where the 4 data collection points during the year, it's not just finding 15 minutes in the secondary school curriculum, because that's not easy to do. It's much easier at primary school because the teacher is working with them all the time. So what we're doing for next year is we're building some lessons around the data collection, and it might fit into the PSHE curriculum quite nicely. So it won't just be, is the survey, spend 15 minutes, go in and complete the responses, because the students won't really understand the wider context of why they're doing it. I think if we can implement this effectively with some lesson plans and some resources, teachers can take their time. They can use a 45-minute lesson to complete this, and there'll be some learning involved. We'll talk about the importance of self-efficacy and how it links to their well-being and their school performance. So I think this is something that we need to work on, not only to increase the honesty and to give students the framing and the context that's needed to elicit that honesty when they're completing the surveys, but also it will help us with these comparisons that we've been talking about. Someone said to me once, well, that's great that you're improving children's well-being by 15%. Maybe if your mentors weren't involved, they could have improved by 25%. And that's what caused us to introduce these, prompted us to introduce these shadow groups, because we wanted to know that we were making a difference, that we weren't necessarily causing harm or hindering their development. And it was only then when we identified the wellbeing gap, because it did show quite evidently that our intervention is working, because those children who have a similar starting point weren't making that progress. So that's where the wellbeing gap came from. Something I did want to ask you here, because you've talked about diet again, but isn't it interesting how at primary level it's sleep, diet, and personal development that are seeing the biggest improvements? So those 3 of the domains. And then at secondary, it's the opposite. It's physical activity, self-efficacy, and emotional well-being.
Yeah.
Now, that's something that we've not had as an insight before. And I think we need to sit on this a little bit longer and just think about what we do about it. It could be that we say, well, those well-being areas are more susceptible to change at primary age and secondary age, so we should double down on them. A primary school program should have more of a sleep, diet, and personal development focus, strength-based coaching, work on what works, rather than saying, well, we're doing a good job there, let's now focus on the other 3. But it could be, for example, in secondary, well, physical activity, that makes sense to me. Now, reducing levels of physical activity and exercise with children and young people, but secondary schools have a more active PE department. There are more things for them to do. I know it might change from key stage 3 to key stage 4, potentially in adolescents, different in boys and girls, but it's interesting that that's increasing more in secondary than it is in primary. Self-efficacy, and again, in emotional well-being. Now, I know that we're only talking about our mentees here, and this is where that comparison and context is important, because most literature says that children's emotional well-being decreases in secondary schools, but ours is shown an increase. So that's my initial reaction to those insights that you shared. But what would you advise here, Bella, from a programmatic perspective? Do you think that we should be focusing more on those areas that are already increasing, or do you think it's better for us to look at the ones that didn't, the areas that didn't make as much change in that period?
That's a really interesting question. And in all honesty, I'd want to take some time to think about that and come back. But I mean, for me, first and foremost, I think it's really helpful to have this data. And I think we should continue to track this and hopefully have enough data in our non-mentee groups, our shadows and our others, to be able to have those comparative points. Because as you say, for example, emotional well-being, that may be a pattern that we don't expect, but when we look at our other 2 groups, that can kind of reveal something, or I can't tell you what we'll find, but I think to be kind of data led in those decisions is really sensible. So it's something that we should continue to monitor and use to guide the approach there.
And this links back to something that we've done previously in research, where we looked at the individual timetables and programs that were taking place. So, for example, if we've got an outlying school that's doing really well at primary with, I don't know, let's say physical activity, one that doesn't normally come through in the literature to say is increasing at the same rate as some of the other domains, but it may be in 1 or 2 particular schools. And that's where we can drill down and say, well, what's happening? What's the mentor doing there? What's happening in the school? Because that's different to the aggregate data. And equally, where things aren't moving, we could have a look at what the program says, and maybe it's because our mentor in that particular school isn't focused on that domain. That doesn't come through in their mentoring programs, or they may not be doing vibrant and varied after school program. It might be they're not doing much in the way of physical activity, and that's reflected in the data. So not only is it worth us looking at the outcomes and these outputs, it's also looking at the inputs and what the program looks like, because yes, it's a primary school, it's Project Hero, it's got a certain number of active ingredients, but they're not the same in every single school and for every single young person. So I think we shouldn't ignore that, because there's a combination of different inputs here that lead to the different outputs that we're seeing. So there's probably not a question there, but it's something for us to go away and look at, because we are doing further work, and you're involved in this with us as well, with new features that we're adding to the EDT in September, and somewhere in the system to track inputs and what the programs look like, so we can correlate the inputs with what we're seeing as outcomes. That would be really interesting for us to do. So that's maybe something for us to look at. But am I right in saying you said in secondary school, our mentees are making sort of 20% bigger improvements in the shadows? Was it
20.
20 times? 20 times. So I know there was some research recently just released from ASCL. I think it was the Impact Ed group that did this and talked about when children fall out of love with school and education. And it's this is primary to secondary transition again. And it's found that 1 in 4, so 25% of pupils had lower engagement rates in year 7 than they did in year 6. So this is something that definitely interesting for me here, because we're seeing our mentees. I know that we're talking well-being here rather than engagement, so we're not comparing like with like, but that's pretty huge, isn't it? 20 times.
Yes. Yeah, it's a really, really interesting finding. And even, our mentees are doing better than our other groups in primary and secondary, which is also a really interesting finding.
Now, I know we've got this Accelerate project, which you referred to earlier, where we're trying to do some work earlier on in the journey. So we're tracking their data in year 6 before they go into secondary school, and then we'll follow them on that journey. But it is something that we have always done a good job with, and I think it's so important to get off on the right foot in secondary schools. This is why we're doing more work with secondaries now, because our mentors were initially focused in generally key stage 2, but also some key stage 1 work. If we align our research here with what ASCL and Impact Ed found, it's so important to capture that 25% who fall out of love with school. And I think we can identify those using our tracking and identification systems. And we know now that if we engage with them effectively in year 7, 8, and 9, we can see these improvements. I'm saying 7, 8, and 9 because you don't have as many year 10 and 11 programs. So the majority of the data here at secondary level is, I think, year 7, 8, and 9. And they're responsible for that 20 times improvement. So I think there's 2 things that we need to do here. Capture the 25% who are about to disengage from school, and then put them on the right program so we can show those 20 times improvements. I need to look a little bit closer at that research, and they did have an engagement survey that they used. So it'd be interesting to unpick that a little bit more and see how we can map that over onto our data, because we do have some engagement metrics in our classroom climate and pupil performance survey, but they're not part of the Wellbeing Compass domains. And in our logic model, we have a simple formula where wellbeing plus mindset equals performance improvements. So I think that mindset piece is something that we need to unpick a little bit more. But have you had a chance to look at that survey yet, the one that Impact Ed used?
I'm not sure that I've seen that yet, but I will put that top of my list.
It's only very recently. I think it might have been last week or even the week before, but it's again highlighting the importance of getting off to the best start possible in secondary. And if you lose the child, then it's difficult to get them back. So there's some interesting work in here we can do, I think, for us as we're going into next academic year, but also maybe could feed into our T3.
No, that's like a very interesting piece of research. I was reading something the other day as well about year 7 and transition, and I think you've kind of just said it yourself now, but there's obviously the accelerate element, which is what we can do between year 6 and year 7, and particularly if we're already seeing a dipping in year 6. We know this is a really important period, but also what we do in year 7 once they start as well, that's also the transition period. So I think there's kind of 2 elements there to the transition that we can really look at and focus in on.
Well, We've covered a lot of ground as always. Some of it was planned, most of it wasn't, but that's the beauty of these conversations. Now, our next webinar, T3, it's going to be an interesting one because we're hoping to collect data the end, I think it's the last week in June and the first week in July. The reason why we're doing it a little bit earlier at the end of this term compared to the end of the autumn and spring terms is because a lot of school meetings and meetings with our head teacher clients, they're interested to see the data before the summer holidays hit and September madness starts. So we kept them a little bit sooner. That will mean that you'll have access to the data hopefully by mid-July, but it means that we're not going to be able to analyze it and get together on a call like this, I don't think, until the middle of August, maybe even September. So just to give people an idea of when the next one will be available. Because it's the end of the year, there'll be, I guess, a different level of analysis here where we're very much focused on the difference between T0 to T3. We'll do maybe some, I know I refer to it as fancy maths, the things that I certainly didn't do when I was in school. But I think there's going to be a couple of things that I'd like to see in the T3 analysis, as well as that, almost like the summative report. How effective has it been? I'm also interested in the qualitative side of that, and in which cases has it been most effective. I know when I'm looking at the reports we're sending to clients, we always try and spotlight people or two to show the individual impact with some feedback and some statement from teachers and our health mentor as well to go alongside the data. And how I do that is by looking at school performance metrics, so attendance, punctuality, positive and negative behaviour points. And I look at the children who have made the most progress there. And then I cross-reference that with their EDT data. And most often than not, it's showing that well-being is significantly improved. And that's led to those school improvements. But it'd be interesting from your side as well if you could look at some of the outliers in terms of schools and pupils, and that'll be really rich information for us. And in the past, we've found that the students who have made the most progress have been supported by a mentor who is more experienced. So it might be that we do some analysis there with our first year mentors compared with our third year mentors, for example. But is there anything else that you'd be looking to see in T3 analysis?
I think that's a really interesting point just to say first, and I've made a note of that. In T3, I think to continue the primary secondary work, because I think that's been really kind of illuminating, and that's something that we're, I think, planning to do some fancy maths on. So I look forward to that. I think that is kind of the key thing for me. I mean, obviously, we're really interested to see how things have been working from the baseline, and we'll finally be able to do that by the end of the year. I think from the picture that we're seeing, we can kind of have an idea of how that will look, but it will be interesting to do some stats on that, moving beyond just the descriptive statistics. I think those are the kind of key things now, but I think it's probably fair to say that we're kind of always discussing these things, and if mentors have any suggestions, that we would be really keen to hear those and integrate that into what we're doing, would be my perspective.
Well, I know we have an impact report as well that we'll be producing as a result of all of this, and normally gets released at our conference at the end of August, last week of August. So that will be made available to anyone who's listening who wants to have a written summary of what we've been talking about here. But I'm just looking at the chat, and it doesn't seem like we've got any questions to answer here, Bella. You'd be pleased to know. So we'll be finishing almost on the hour, which is good news. And thanks again for all your insights here. And I think that the journey that we've been on together, initially with Astrid last year and now with you this year, it really is helping to inform practice, not just looking back over our shoulders to justify schools' investments of their limited resources at the moment. It's helping to improve practice, and that's what this is all about. So thank you for today and for your ongoing efforts, and looking forward to talking to you again in August.
Yes.
Thanks, Bella.
Thanks very much.